Come all you weary, come all you thirsty, come to the well that never runs dry. Drink of the water, come and thirst no more. Come all you sinners, come find His mercy, come to the table, He will satisfy. Taste of His goodness, find what you're looking for. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. Bring your addictions, come lay them down at the foot of the cross. Jesus is waiting there with open arms, oh, with open arms. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. The power of hell forever defeated. Now it is well, I'm walking in freedom. For God so loved, God so loved the world. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. The power of hell forever defeated. Now it is well, I'm walking in freedom. For God so loved, God so loved the world. Bring all your failures, bring your addictions, come lay them down at the foot of the cross. Jesus is waiting, God so loved the world.
Hey folks, happy Easter to you. I'm David Robinson, and I'm really grateful that you're spending part of your Easter tuning in. Thanks for being here as we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You know, Walt Disney's daughter wrote a biography of her dad some time ago, and in it, she talked about when she was a little girl. She didn't know who her dad was, like what he did, the big deal that he was. And then when she was like 6 or 7 years old, she was at school, and there were kids in her school who said, you know, Mickey Mouse, the Magic Kingdom, all that kind of stuff. That's your dad. Well, when she got home, she marches right up to him and she said, Dad, how come you never told me you're Walt Disney? Like you're a big deal. How come you never told me who you are? The disciples of Jesus couldn't really claim what Walt Disney's daughter did. I mean, they couldn't say, Jesus, why didn't you tell us who you really are? Like, why didn't you show us who you really are and that you're a really big deal? They couldn't say that because Jesus had been telling them and showing them who he really was all along the way. Leading up to Easter this year, around here at CCC, we've been trying to get clarity about who Jesus really is by looking at all these instances where he describes himself. And what we've discovered is that he's way, 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 way more than what most people in our culture and in our country ascribe him to be. See, most people think Jesus was a really nice guy who did a lot of nice things a long time ago. Like he's one of many people down through the years who have espoused a little bit of wisdom and had a positive impact on some folks. And maybe, like if you push it, maybe he's pointed some people to God. But that's not even close to what we've discovered about him. Jesus, he's not just another guy. And he's not even just a religious leader or some sort of prophet. He's not just a solid teacher or a spouter of wise sayings. And Jesus never claimed to be those things. What he did claim over and over again was that he was God. He's the very Son of God. The Son of Man, he would say a lot about himself, meaning he is God in the flesh, come to reveal himself to us. And he was clear on his purpose too. He was clear on what his whole life was leading up to, what we're celebrating this weekend, his suffering and death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. He spoke of both those things so very often. And you would figure, like of all people, his followers, his closest disciples would have picked up on what Jesus was saying about himself and his purpose. That he's the one true God, come to suffer and die and then rise again to usher in the new reality of his kingdom, to reconcile us to himself through his physical death on the cross and his rising from the grave. But his disciples, and of course, we're on the other side of all this where we can see this, but his disciples didn't get there to understand all this very quickly. And you'd think that they would have. Like their own experiences with Jesus along the way should have clued them in. The healings, the walking on water thing, the calming of a raging storm with just a word, feeding a multitude with a little kid's lunch, raising someone from the dead like we talked about last week. They struggled with this. Think about it. They spent so much time with Jesus, and yet they seemed to be so fuzzy on who he was for such a long time. And let's be honest, gang, we struggle with this too, sorting through the real Jesus. And there's so much at stake here. Sometimes what we can do is we can just put Jesus in a little box. Boxes do wonderful things in our world. They bring wonderful order to our world. Like they can keep cereal from spilling out and books from tumbling around. When it comes to containing stuff, boxes are pretty good. But when it comes to defining Jesus, no box really works. His contemporaries tried to box him in. They designed an assortment of boxes for him, but he never fit one. Like they called him a revolutionary, and then he paid his taxes. They labeled him as a country bumpkin of a carpenter, but he confounded even scholars. They came to see his miracles, but he refused to cater to them. He defied easy definitions. He was a Jew who attracted Gentiles. He was a holy man who hung out with racy prostitutes and traitor tax collectors. In a male-dominated society, he recruited females. In an anti-Roman culture, he opted not to denounce Rome. He talked like a king, and yet he lived like a pilgrim. People tried to designate him, box him in, but they couldn't. And we still try today. Politicians sometimes pull box-sized versions of Jesus off the shelf, asserting that Jesus would certainly vote this way or that way. The Jesus of politics comes in handy around elections. Some churches and preachers assure us that prosperity is only a prayer away. Just make a donation first and you'll be good to go. Some folks reduce Jesus down to a handful of doctrines, kind of like a recipe, and they have all the ingredients. If you mix them up just right, the Jesus of our making will appear. A box-sized God. But God, Jesus, he's so much bigger than we think he is. There's this one episode in the Bible when Jesus took Peter, James, and John on a bit of a mind-blowing, box-blowing hike up a mountain, Mount Hermon, actually. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all describe this hike. Luke says that Jesus' intent started out as prayer. He took Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And at some point while praying, Jesus, this man born to Mary, grew up in a little old hick town called Nazareth in rural Galilee, had a job as a humble carpenter for the first 30 years of his life. That same man, Jesus, he erupted into a cosmic figure of light. And Matthew 17 says, there he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Light just spilled from him. It was brilliant and explosive, and it had to be shocking, Brightness just came through every pore of his skin and every stitch of his clothing. Jesus was on fire, man. Mark's gospel has a version of this happening too. And Mark wants us to know that Jesus' clothes, they glistened white, whiter than any bleach could make them. He wants us to know that all this radiance that they were seeing was not the work of some sort of laundry. Mark's saying it was the presence of God. The Bible habitually equates God with light and light with holiness. 1 John 1:5 says, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Or 1 Timothy tells us that he dwells in unapproachable light. Jesus himself declared multiple times, I am the light of the world. The transfigured Jesus Christ is really Jesus in his purest form, his truest self. He's kind of wearing his pre-Bethlehem and post-resurrection wardrobe, Not an ordinary Galilean, but a towering and furious figure who won't be managed. He won't be boxed in. And so in a flash, Peter, James, and John, they were just overcome by the brilliance of Jesus. They'd seen, again, Jesus do some pretty incredible things, miraculous things. Again, walk on water, multiply bread, talk to the wind, banish demons, raise the dead. And now he's a standing torch. And he was just getting warmed up because what happens next is that two visitors appear. One was Moses and the other was Elijah. Both of them had lived years and years before Jesus, but they're here now with Jesus on this mountain while Jesus is blazing like the sun. They somehow, Moses and Elijah, stepped through the thin veil that separates earth from paradise, like you do, I guess. And Luke says they were speaking about Jesus' exodus from this world, which was about to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. Wouldn't you love to know specifically what they were talking about? Like, maybe they were encouraging Jesus for the last leg of his earthly journey. Or maybe they were telling him how proud they were of him. Or maybe Jesus was giving them instructions. After all, Moses and Elijah, sort of the Washington and Lincoln of the Jewish people, they're there now as an answer to Jesus praying. Think about that. The steward of the law and the teacher of the prophets, Moses and Elijah, respond to Jesus' bidding. Are you getting the picture here? And you got to figure that Peter, James, and John are wondering, what is going on? Like, even though Jesus had told them over and over and over again who he was God in the flesh, they got to be wondering, who is this guy? Now, unfortunately, at this point, Peter saw it fit to clear his throat and speak. And he spouts something out. He's babbling on about building a shelter for each of them. He basically opened his mouth and inserted his foot, there. And God wouldn't even permit Peter to finish his sentence. While he was still speaking, the Bible says, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Some versions of that say beloved son. Luke's version says the chosen one. However it's specifically translated for us, it means Jesus is priceless and unique. There's no one like Jesus. No one. Not Moses, not Elijah, not Peter, not James, not John, not anybody. No one in heaven or on earth. Jesus, the Father declared, is not a son or even a great son or even the best of all sons. He's the beloved son. He's the chosen one. And Peter and the other disciples there, and maybe us too, they kind of missed this. Peter had placed Jesus in a respectable box labeled, great men of history or a really awesome teacher or a super cool cat with some super cool powers or a nice guy who did some nice things. Peter wanted to give Jesus and Moses and Elijah equal honor, and God wouldn't have any of that because Jesus has no counterparts. Well, fortunately, in this episode, Peter, James, and John, they didn't speak anymore. But on that mountain, they saw what nobody else had seen, Jesus Christ in his cosmic greatness. And it ended up just being overwhelming to them. Matthew tells us they fell on their faces and he says they were terrified. I mean, fire on the mountain led to fear on the mountain. And maybe that's why Jesus took them up there to begin with, to try, again, to expand their view and understanding of him. Maybe he saw the box in which they were confining him. I mean, he knew the future that awaited them, the fireside denials of Peter, the prisons of Jerusalem and Rome, the demands that would come with the church, the persecutions of Nero that awaited them. That was all in their future. And a box-sized version of God simply wouldn't do. It just wouldn't work. And so Jesus, he tried to kind of blow the sides off their preconceived notions. And I kind of hope he does that with us too this Easter, because we need the transfigured Jesus, one who spits holy fires and who convenes and commands historical figures and who occupies the loftiest perch and wears the only true crown of the universe, the glorious one, God's beloved Son, God himself in the flesh, come to save us. And on this day, the resurrected one, firstborn from among the dead, as Paul would say a few years later in Colossians. Our view of Jesus, it really needs to expand in order to match as best we can who he really is. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a collection of children's books called The Chronicles of Narnia. I have a feeling a lot of you have probably read some of those books. It's about these four siblings, 2 brothers, 2 sisters who find their way from time to time to a really magical land called Narnia, where they have all these incredible adventures, really the adventures of their lifetime. And one of the books is called Prince Caspian. And Lucy, who's the youngest sister, she sees Aslan, who's this lion. He's the great son. He's the Christ figure. And Lucy sees Aslan for the first time in many, many years. And from her view, he's changed since their last encounter. And his size, it surprises her. And she tells him this. She says, Aslan, you're bigger. And he says, well, that's because you are. You're older, little one. And she says, not because you are? And he says, I am not. But every year you grow, you'll find me bigger. And so it is with Jesus Christ. The longer we live in him, the greater he becomes in us. It's not that he changes, but we do. We see more of him. We see dimensions and aspects and characteristics we never saw before, increasing and astonishing increments of his purity and his power and his uniqueness. After Peter, James, and John get a glimpse of who Jesus really is, who he's been telling them he is, he reminds them of what he's about to do, why he came. And he says, hey, don't tell anybody about what you just saw until after I've been raised from the dead. Again, Jesus has just shown them who he is and told them one more time, hey, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die, but I'm going to come back from the dead. And Mark tells us that they can't figure out what he means when he's talking about being raised from the dead. They still didn't grasp who he really was or what his purpose was. Even after he was crucified and raised from the dead and he appeared to them, they couldn't make sense of it. He appeared to them multiple times after his crucifixion and his rising from the dead. A couple times, they were scared stiff, hiding behind locked doors, and Jesus appeared to them. One time they're on the shoreline where they shared some breakfast together, and Jesus appears to them again to clarify to them his identity and purpose. Scholars say he appeared to his followers at least 10 times after rising from the dead, and he performed these different miracles, and he continued to teach them who he was and what his plan had been. And it seemed to just take them a long, long time to figure it all out, who Jesus is and what he came to do. Eventually, they got it. I mean, it took a while, but they got it. Post-resurrection, they got it. The light kind of went on for them. And when they did finally get it, oh my goodness. I mean, you couldn't hold them back. When they understood Jesus isn't just a good guy who did some good things. He's the glorious God of the universe, the exact replica of God the Father, and he has come to rescue us by making peace through his blood spilled on the cross. When they realized that, they had this boldness and courage that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In fact, the difference in Jesus' followers is one of the strongest evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. They went from hiding behind locked doors after Jesus had been crucified, thinking that they were next. They were going to be captured and killed next, to going to every corner of their world and talking about the resurrected Jesus. I mean, they'd tell anybody, anywhere, and face anything because they came to understand who Jesus really was and what he had done for them, and it completely transformed their lives. We are here today. Our church exists today in large part because the resurrection transformed them. What would happen in your life if Jesus grew bigger and bigger and bigger and greater and greater and greater with each passing, day or week or month or year for you? When Jesus Christ was greater to them, their fears diminished. A big God for them translated into big courage. A small view of God generated no courage. A passive, kind of puny, fireless, boxed-in Jesus had no power over the evils and darkness of the world. But a blazing big, powerful, death-defeating Jesus, he has some transformative power. And when you and I really get who Jesus is and what he's done, we can change everything about us. What more is it going to take for you to see Jesus for who he really is? Have you gotten to the place where the person of Jesus and the message of Jesus have just seized your soul, seized your life? Who is Jesus? Well, he's the hinge of history, gang. He's the beloved Son. He's the exact representation of the Father. He's the good shepherd and the bread of life and the light of the world. He's the King of kings and Lord of lords. He's the greatest teacher who ever lived. And he's the greatest mind that ever thought. He sparked the greatest movement that has ever spread. He offered the greatest gift that has ever been given. He alone mastered life, and he alone conquered death, and he alone overcame sin, and he alone grows more present with each passing year. He is the Son of God, the resurrection and the life, the Savior of the world. That's who Jesus is. And he stepped out of the grave so we could know him and be connected to him and walk in this life with him and straight on into the next one with him. Do you have eyes to see who Jesus really is this Easter?
There was a moment when the lights went out, when death had claimed its victory. The King of love had given up his life, the darkest day in history. There on a cross they made for sinners. For every curse his blood atoned. One final breath and it was finished. But not the end we could have known. For the earth began to shake, and the veil was torn. What sacrifice was made as the heavens roar. All hail King Jesus,
we're going to celebrate communion together. So now's the time to grab some bread and juice. Each week, we center our time around remembering what Jesus has done for us, that through his death on the cross and his resurrection from the grave, we've been forgiven of our shortcomings, our broken parts, our sin. Because of what Jesus did for us, we've been made right with God. And we eat a piece of bread and drink some juice to remember that. The bread reminds us that Jesus gave himself up for us, and the juice reminds us that his blood was spilled on our behalf. Let's spend some time honoring what Jesus has done by having communion together.
Till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. Till that stone was moved for good, or the Lamb had conquered death, and the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe, for the souls of all who come to the Father are restored, and the Church of Christ was born.
Thanks again for tuning in today and celebrating Easter with CCC. I hope this online service has been just what you needed today. Community Christian Church has always been committed to helping people find their way back to God because we've all got steps to take. If you'd like to partner with CCC financially and support the ministry efforts of this church, click the Give tab at communitycc.net or text CCC Whitemarsh to the number on the screen. Your continued generosity, it makes a huge difference, makes everything CCC does possible, so thank you. If you're new around here, maybe you've been tuning in or you visited in person at some point in the last year, you're invited to a special night coming up called Dessert with Dave. You'll get to meet some new folks, hear a little bit about who this church is and what makes it tick. It's a lot of fun. There's loads of sugar, and we'll feed you dinner too. Childcare is available if you need that. Make sure and check out communitycc.net/events to RSVP. I'll see you back here next week, and in 2 weeks, it's Ask a Counselor Sunday. We'll have a licensed counselor talking about some of the most important questions he gets asked. You won't want to miss it. Say hi on social media. We'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.